Miruchim haboim, welcome everyone. We're about to begin Be'ezras Hashem together on Daf Samech Beis, Amud Beis, 7 lines from the top. The previous Amud, Rav Ashi explained Rav Chizda, when a person shechs a carbon Pesach, for those who are circumcised and included in the Chabura, as well as Almanas Lizroik, the Dam, that means to then include those who are not counted in the Chabura of uncircumcised, that they should also fulfill their mitzvah of Korban Pesach. So he explained that that person is going to be poisil the carbon, because after all, since the Arelim could themselves hoyil, since they could give themselves a bris milah and become circumcised, therefore they are included as being somebody who's a bar kapara. They're included in somebody who's chayiv the obligation of a carbon Pesach. Now the Gemara challenges that premise that Rav Chizda holds, that we say lechumra hoyil. Says the Gemara, Mosiv Rav Huna B'Reis Rav Yoshua. He asked the following question: Ha Pesach she'ovra shnosoi v'shochtoi b'zmanoi lishmoi. We're talking about a carbon Pesach that a person took the carbon Pesach that was already a year old, and then after designating it, he wants to bring it as a carbon Pesach 1 year later. And we know when it comes to a carbon Pesach, it says it has to be a Zachar ben Shana. So it's invalid. So even though it's a carbon Pesach that was designated carbon Pesach, it now has a designation as a carbon Shlomim. So it says over here, if he shachta bizmanoi lishmoi, he shechs this, what now is a Shlomim, on this designated day, that means on the 14th of Nisan after Chatzois, for the sake of a carbon Pesach, is not going to be valid. V'chein, and similarly, hashoichet acherim l'shem Pesach bizmanoi, or similarly, if he shechs a carbon that's either a shlomim or an oila l'shem Pesach, again on the 14th of Nisan after Chatzois, for the sake of a carbon Pesach, then it's a machloikis. I said it's not valid, but according to Rabbi Eliezer, it's not valid, it's poisil. However, according to Rabbi Yoshua, machshir, it's kosher. So Gemara built up his question, making a diuk. Taima bizmano. The only reason why Rabbi Eliezer says that it's posul is because it's bizman, it's in its designated time. Dahainu, on the 14th of Nisan after Chatzos, the time when the carbon Pesach is supposed to be brought. Diuk, hashaloi bizmanoi kosher. But if this shlomim was brought shaloi bizmanoi, then it would be, yes, kosher, according to Rabbi Eliezer. Ask the Gemara, ve'amai, why should that be? According to Rav Chizda, we should say hoyil, as follows: Neimo hoyil ubizmanoi poisil, shelo bizmano nami poisil. The same way that when we say hoyil, since if we will leave the carbon to then wait for its designated time, dahainu, we would push it off until Yudalid b'Nisan after Chatzois, it would be posul. So then we should also equally say, even when it's going to be a different time that's not designated, the rest of the year should also make it posul, according to this concept of hoyil, according to Rav Chizda. Rav Papa defends Rav Chizda and says, shiny hasam. In regards to the designated time of the carbon Pesach, it's different. Why? The Omar Kro, the Apostle says in regards to the carbon Pesach, Va'amartem zevach Pesach hu Hashem, la Hashem. This is, and you shall say that this is a carbon Pesach that's going to be designated as a carbon Pesach. Hu b'havyosoi. This for its designation. Lo yehu l'shum acherim, not it for the sake of a different carbon, v'lo yacherim l'shmoi, and not a different carbon for its sake. Bizmano shehu pasul l'shum acherim. When it's in its designated time, it is possible if it's going to be made for another type of carbon. Acharim pasulim l'shmoi. Then the others will also be poisil, even if it's for the sake of a carbon Pesach. Shaloi bizmanoi, when it's not going to be, however, in its designated time, the rest of the year, shehu kosher l'shumachim, you bring the carbon Pesach for the sake of a different type of carbon, it will be yes kosher, then acheim keshem lishmoi, therefore another carbon, let's say an oil or shlomim, that you do it for the sake of a carbon Pesach, the rest of the year would yes be then valid. The Gemara now wants to explain what we saw in two different Mishnayos. In one Mishnah we saw that a person shech shelishmoy and shalolishmoy is going to be posel. Yet in our Mishnah it states that a person shechs the Karban Pesach le'oichlov, those who are fitting to eat the Karban Pesach, as well as shaloi le'oichlov, those who are not fitting to eat the Karban Pesach, it's still kosher. Ask the Gemara why the distinction. Now the Gemara will explain. First the Gemara brings the following incident. Rabbi Simloi also lekamed Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Simloi, he came before Rabbi Yochanan. Omar le, he said to Rabbi Yochanan, Nisni limars sefer yuchsin. May my master, Rabbi Yochanan, teach me the Sefer Yuchsin. Sefer Yuchsin was a Sefer that had braisos, various teachings in regard to the Sefer in Tanakh of Divrei Hayomim. Omar le, so Rabbi Yochanan responded to Rabbi Simloi, Mehechan at, from where are you? Omar le, Milud. Vehechan muzbach, from where do you reside currently? B'neher do. Omar le, Rabbi Yochanan therefore said, Ein nidoinin loy lidludin v'lo leneher doin v'kol shekein da'at milud umuzbach meneher do. He said to him to be doiche, to push him aside. He basically said, we don't teach the Sefer Yuchsin to people who are from either initially Lud or reside in Neher Do. And certainly if you are from Lud and currently reside in Neher Do. The Gemara says, however, kafye v'aratze. It says that nonetheless, Rabbi Simloi pressured Rabbi Yochanan, and ultimately Rabbi Yochanan acquiesced. Omar le, so Rabbi Simloi turned to Rabbi Yochanan and said, Nisni begimel yarchi. Let us learn the Sefer Yuchsin in 3 months. I'll be able to then acquire all of its teachings in those 3 months. Shokel kola posak bei. It says that Rabbi Yochanan, he took a glob of mud, of soil, of dirt, and he threw it at Rav Simloi. Omar le, he said to him, Uma beruya the visud Rav Meir bar Teid Rav Chananya ben Tradion. Beruya was a brilliant woman, the wife of Rabbi Meir, the daughter of Chananya ben Tradion. And it states in there, in the following brisa, the Tanya, Tlas Meir Shmaitzasa biyoimo begimel Meir Rabvosa. She learned 300 statements from 300 different Rabbonim every day. Even after 3 years, she didn't complete the limud. And you, Rav Simloi, want to learn all of this in just 3 months. When Rav Simloi was about to take leave of Rabbi Yochanan, Omar le, he said to him, Rabbi, Ma bein lishmoy v'shaloi lishmoy. What is the difference between somebody who shechs the Karban Pesach lishmoy and shaloi lishmoy, u'la'oichlav shaloichlav, versus somebody who shechs it la'oichlav shaloichlav? And again, there's 2 Mishnayos that we learned. The first Mishnah says you shecht the Karban Pesach for those lishmo and for those shaloi lishmo. So then we say that makes it so that it's poisel. On the other hand, our Mishnah states when you shech the Karban Pesach for those who can eat the Karban Pesach, as well as those who cannot. For example, a zoken and a choyle could not eat a kazayis of the meat of the Karban Pesach. It's not poisil. What's the distinction? Omar le, Rabbi Yochanan responds, since you're a young Talmid Chacham, ta ve'emolach, come and I will explain to you the distinction. As follows, and he brings 4 different distinctions between the two. Lishmoy v'shaloi lishmoy, psuloi begufoi, lo'oichlav v'shalo'oichlav ein psuloi begufoi. First of all, he says, when it comes to lishmoy v'lishaloy lishmoy, that is poisel the etzem carbon itself. Whereas when you shech lo'oichlav v'shalo'oichlav, that's not in the carbon, that's a peripheral requirement of the carbon. That means those who are eating the carbon, but it's not on the etzem of the carbon, the goof of the carbon. Lishmo v'shlo lishmoi iyefshar levar isuroi. The second distinction is when you shech the carbon shal lishmo and lishmo, then you cannot distinguish between which is the part that is prohibited and which is not. It's all one part, one animal. So you can't break apart the parts that are isur and the part is that mutter. Whereas when you shech you know which part those who are going to eat and those who cannot eat. You can distinguish between those parts. A third distinction. Lishmo v'lo lishmo yeshno b'dalad avodos. Lo oichlov v'shlo lo oichlov eino ba'arba avodos. When it comes to shechting the carbon Pesach, lishmoyen v'lo lishmoy, that's going to affect all four of the avodas hadam, the shchita, the kabbalah, the halicha, as well as the zrikas hadam. In any one of those four avodos, if it's shaloi v'shlo lishmoy, it's going to be affected adversely. Whereas when it comes to when one shechs oichlov v'shaloi lo oichlov, it's only going to adverse poisa the carbon if it's during the avodah of the shchita. And finally, the fourth distinction, he says, lishmo v'shalo lishmo yeshno b'tzibur kibiyochid. Lo oichlov v'shalo lo oichlov eino b'tzibur kibiyochid. When it comes to shechting lishmo v'shalo lishmo, then the communal tzibur, the communal carbon, the tzibur, is like the individual carbon. Whereas when it comes to shechting a carbon Pesach, that itself is only miyuchad to a carbon Pesach where there's a yachid, but not for a carbon tzibur. Now Rav Ashi says that one of these distinctions is not really a separate distinction. Says Rav Ashi Omar, psuloi begufoy vi efshar levarer isuroi chad milsehi. He points out those two things that he wanted to say was distinctions. Rabbi Yochanan, that when it comes to lishmo and shalom, the psul is begufoy, and the second distinction of that it's iyashar levarer, it's impossible to mevarer isuroi. That he says is one of the same, and therefore really comes out to be only three different distinctions. What is that? Why is that the same? The matam omar psula begufoy. Why did they say that there's a psula begufoy when it comes to lishmoy and shel lishmoy hare? Itself is not really the goof. It's not really the physical goof of the behema that's being changed. It's still a machshava, and still we say that this it's considered to be different than la'oichle shalochav. Why is that? Because mishum de'ef levar isura. The reason why is because of this distinction. Since it's impossible to mevarer the chelek that is considered to be osir and that which is going to be mutter, that itself is the reason why, in contrast to a case where you're shechting l'oichle v'shalo oichlav, that makes it so that it's considered to be begufoy when it's l'shma and shalo l'shma. And that's why it's different than la'oichle shalo oichlav when it's not shaloi begufoy. Omar Rami Barav Yuda Omar Rav. He points out in regards to the loss of the Sefer Yuchsin. He says, Miyoim shenigna Sefer Yuchsin, from the time that Sefer Yuchsin was forgotten, Toshash koichan shel chachamim, v'koha meor eineim. The strength of the chachamim was weakened, and the illuminance of the eyes became more dimmed. In other words, they lost Torah knowledge as a result of forgetting Sefer Yuchsin. Omar Mar Zutra, Rav Zutra gives an example of this loss, this tremendous loss of Torah knowledge from the fact that Sefer Yuchsin was forgotten. He gives an example, Bein Otzil la'otzil. There's our two times that's mentioned. There's a posuk in the first parak of Divrei Hayomim. In the 8th parak of Divrei Hayomim. And then a similar, almost the exact same posuk is also stated in the next parak in Divrei Hayomim. So in between these psukim, when it mentions Otzil la'otzil, that was the name, right? I'll just read you. It says in the first posuk, la'otzil shisha bonim. He had 7 children, and Be'el Shmosim lists these 6 children. At the end it says Kol Eila b'nei Otzil. So it brings almost the exact same pasuk after several psukim in between, one parak in between, and states over here, Rabbi Zutra, Ta'inu dalid meyos gamli de darsha. That means that were so many droshos, there were 400 camel loads of droshos, even in between this one parak, between the word Otzil and Otzil, whereby you show how much Torah knowledge was actually forgotten as a result when Sefer Yuchsin was then nignaz.